Hello and welcome back to the final recording for Module 2. And in this final recording, we're going to talk all about energy. Energy is defined by physicists as the ability to do work. So in part 1 of this chapter, we talked about matter, and energy is the ability to move matter. And this idea, as abstract as it sounds, is fundamental to biology and fundamental to a lot of the processes within environmental science. Life depends on rearranging atoms, moving substances. These intricate movements represent work and they require energy. The total amount of energy in any object is the sum of two different forms of energy that will differentiate between. Potential energy is stored energy that's available to do work. Think about the um, energy in a battery, energy behind a dam. We'll talk about hydroelectric dams as an energy source. Those function as an energy source because of a buildup of energy behind that dam. A gallon of gasoline is potential energy, it's stored energy. A candy bar or a granola bar is potential energy. When you eat that candy bar, you can break apart the bonds of molecules and release that into usable energy, which is kinetic energy. So kinetic energy is the energy of motion. Water behind a dam converts from potential to kinetic energy as that water is allowed to move over the dam. So any moving object possesses this form of kinetic energy. Light is a form of kinetic energy. Sounds have kinetic energy. All the molecules inside your cell have kinetic energy. And again, these are foundational topics because we'll be talking about sources of energy in much more detail later in the semester. We briefly talked about molecules and compounds at the beginning of this chapter and chemical bonds that hold those atoms together in molecules are a form of potential and kinetic energy. So the sugar molecules in an apple that we eat, for example, the bonds that hold together the carbons and hydrogens and oxygens of those sugar molecules are storing energy. When we break those bonds, when we break apart that molecule, that releases energy. And again, that is a form of kinetic energy. Central to this discussion of energy is the study of how energy is transformed. So thermodynamics is just that. It's the study of energy transformations. It's the kind of laws of physics and chemistry that describe how energy is transferred. And we need to talk about two important laws of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is what's referred to as the law of energy conservation. It states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, although it can be converted into other forms. For example, photosynthesis is a process that uses light energy and through a series of reactions transforms that into sugar, which is a form of kinetic energy. What this means, and this is going to have very significant relevance to discussions we have later in the semester, but what this means is that the total amount of energy in the universe does not change. The form of it changes. Living cells can convert energy from one form to another through processes like photosynthesis and cellular respiration, but the total amount in the universe does not change. Your book goes into a little bit more detail with these processes. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time reviewing them, but photosynthesis and cellular respiration are both processes that deal with energetics, and they are complementary processes. So in that their products and reactants are linked with each other. So photosynthesis, as I mentioned a moment ago, takes energy in the form of sunlight and is able to convert it into sugar, a form of potential energy or chemical energy. To do that, photosynthesis also requires water and releases oxygen. That water is a product of cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is the process that makes chemical energy that our cells can use, also known as ATP. It's a process that breaks down the very sugar that's made by photosynthesis through, again, a series of reactions that ultimately makes that energy a form of energy usable for our cells and releases carbon dioxide. Once again, the very same carbon dioxide that's used by photosynthesis. You'll notice that in both of these processes, there's some energy that's lost in the form of heat. So energy is not created or destroyed, it's transformed, and the total amount in the universe does not change. Related to this is the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics states that every energy transformation is efficient. There's always some loss of energy to the surroundings as heat. And we saw that in this diagram, and we can see another representation of that here, both on a global scale as energy moves between different types of organisms. And, again, in a single plant cell that's doing cellular respiration and photosynthesis, as part of each of those reactions, energy is lost in the form of heat. This is an irreversible process. Cells can't use the energy that's been converted to heat. And again, we can look at this at the scale of an individual cell. And we can look at it at the scale of an ecosystem where, again, these conversions are not completely inefficient, or excuse me, are not completely inefficient, are in fact inefficient, where some energy is lost. We're going to contrast in a moment the rates of efficiency between different types of organisms, and that's what the 1% and 10% is referring to there. So what we'll come back to with respect to these laws of thermodynamics is that we can't break the laws of nature. There are limits, and our use of energy is not efficient. The universe increases in entropy over time. That's what this aging process that's shown here is meant to communicate. I'll define that more formally in a moment. So heat energy is disordered, it cannot be used, it's not converted back to a useful form. And so it takes a lot of energy to stay ordered, right? Cells are constantly using energy to build molecules, to perform chemical reactions, and to carry out life's processes. Since that heat is constantly being lost to the universe and heat energy is disordered, the entropy of the universe is constantly increasing. And entropy is essentially a measure of randomness, a measure of disorder. So for example, in an instant, this highly organized light bulb is transformed into broken glass and metal fragments. Entropy in that example has irreversibly increased. We went from an intact, highly ordered bulb to a highly disordered, smashed bulb. No matter how many times you drop the smashed glass and metal, the pieces are not going to reorganize themselves back into a light bulb. Okay, so that's an increase in entropy. When we think about this at kind of a global scale, right, the only way to reverse or the only way to slow the increase of randomness is to spend energy to reverse its effects. But that comes at a cost of an increase in entropy somewhere else. Okay, so what are some of the consequences of the second law, right? Machines give off heat. Machines need to be kept cool while running. So energy has to be input to maintain temperature of things like cars and computers. Things break down over time. Machines stop functioning. Things fall apart much more often than they fall together. It also has consequences for life. Living things eventually wear out and die. And again, we put energy towards slowing that down, but the energy comes at a cost somewhere else. So organisms can increase in complexity as long as something else decreases in complexity by a greater amount. So ultimately, life remains ordered and complex because the sun is constantly supplying energy to Earth, but the entropy of the universe as a whole, including the sun, is increasing. So, as I mentioned earlier, the two processes we'll briefly reference are photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So, the sun is the ultimate source of energy on the planet, and the amount of energy we get from the sun is relatively constant. There are groups of organisms that we refer to as autotrophs. That word literally means self-feeder. And autotrophs are organisms that are capable of photosynthesis that can, once again, use the energy in light to produce a sugar. That process also requires carbon dioxide and water and releases oxygen. Consumers convert that sugar back into energy or break it down to release its energy. And that process is called cellular respiration. Once again, as I reviewed before, consumers do this process by breaking the bonds that hold the sugar molecule together. That releases a usable form of energy for cells that we call ATP. It produces the byproduct of carbon dioxide and water that are used by photosynthesis. And again, in both processes, some energy is lost or released as heat. Now, one of the areas that we want to consider these energy transformations is through feeding relationships. Trophic structure describes just that, feeding structure. These are the feeding relationships between different organisms in a community. And we can look at this in a simple way. Most ecosystems are much more complex than what's shown here. But we can look at the levels at which different organisms feed in a community. So remember, producer is the term that refers to autotrophs that are capable of photosynthesis. Consumers are not able to make their own food, so rely on consuming food. So in a terrestrial food chain, a primary producer would be a plant. In a marine food chain, that could be some algae or some phytoplankton. So they are at the base of the food chain. These are the organisms that are taking the energy in sunlight and converting that into biomass, a form of energy that then is available to the rest of the ecosystem. So we differentiate between different levels of consumption. So there are primary consumers, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, so on and so forth, depending on the complexity of a food chain. Herbivores are primary consumers that eat plants. The marine equivalent would be zooplankton. Carnivores are secondary consumers. They are the animals that eat the herbivores that eat the plant. Some food chains end there. Other food chains have different levels of carnivores. So in this example, this red-tailed hawk is feeding on a snake that feeds on a mouse, that feeds on an herbivore, that feeds on a plant, right? So there's more levels of exchanges. And again, in reality, most ecosystems are much more complex. Now, we know that these energy exchanges are going to be inefficient, having covered the laws of thermodynamics. And they in fact are, because with each exchange between each level in that food chain, energy is lost in the form of heat. This is referred to as the 10% rule. 10% is an average, but generally only 10% of the available biomass in any one of these levels is available to the next level in a food chain. And about 90% is lost in the form of heat. So of the And you could think about this in terms of biomass, you can think about it in terms of calories. So say there are 10,000 calories worth of energy in the plant level, then only 1,000 will be incorporated or utilized by primary consumers, only 100 by the secondary consumers, and so on and so forth. So in this example, a quaternary consumer would require way, way, way more calories worth of plants, right? So 90% of that is, again, inefficient, lost as heat. Now, as I said, the 10% rule is an average. It's a range between about 5 and 20%. Birds and mammals tend to be less efficient because it costs a lot to be endothermic, right? We regulate our temperature with our heat. That's a byproduct of cellular respiration. Fish are an example of an organism that's pretty much around 10%. And then there are organisms like insects and microbes that can be much, much more efficient. So the 10% is just a general rule. And again, this gets multiplied in the example I showed you over the length of the food chain. A good point to just briefly reference is that it's hard to place decomposers and detritivores on this list. So decomposers and detritivores are organisms that feed on organic material, just like everybody else on this food chain, but they feed on dead or decaying organic material as opposed to living organic material. They play essential ecosystem services because they break down materials, they recycle nutrients. And so essentially everyone else in the food chain depends on the activity of decomposers, but they're not at one single level, right? So they are acting and breaking down matter at every level within a food chain. Just another example of the transfer of energy. Oh, and I should have emphasized, the 10% rule starts once biomass has been incorporated into an ecosystem. Photosynthesis is actually even less efficient. Only about 1% of energy that reaches the atmosphere is captured by plants for photosynthesis. So that's hugely inefficient. And then again, the 10% scales from there. Now, in reality, feeding relationships are much more complex. A food web is a version of a food chain that's a bit more realistic in that it shows that most organisms are either being consumed by lots of different organisms or are consuming lots of different organisms. So, for example, you have a variety of organisms in a marine food chain that might feed on the phytoplankton. And then the primary consumers like krill and copepods are consumed by a lot of secondary, tertiary, or even quaternary consumers. So krill is being consumed by carnivorous plankton. It's being consumed by fish and birds and seals and baleen whales. And so again, in reality, the feeding structure is much more complex than just a simple food chain communicates. So food chains shows a series of relationships. Food webs show all of the possible linkages and all of the connections in a community with respect to feeding. So it quickly becomes more complicated and there's more overlap when we account for all of those different relationships. The last thing I want to address is what happens when trophic structure is disturbed. And you have this link here. I'm also going to post it on Canvas as a discussion, but this is a really interesting example of how important trophic balance is, how important it is that that these feeding relationships are held in balance. And the removal or extirpation of wolves from Yellowstone, and then the subsequent reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone is a fascinating example of how the removal of a top predator can affect populations at every level of that food chain, and in fact can also impact kind of physical structures in the landscape as well. So you'll have an opportunity to watch that video and comment a bit more about it. Okay, so we're going to end there. And our next unit is ecology, where we'll kind of build on some of these ideas that I've been talking about in the last few minutes, which are kind of ecological themes. And once again, the foundational topics that were introduced in this module are all points that we'll be coming back to later in the semester.